Hi team, Coach Alexa here. I wanted to do a bit of a video on GPS accuracy. A lot of runners I'd say, get quite into the detail, don't we, with the data, the stats, looking at, Strava or our watches or apps or whatever after each run and analysing things and looking at progress, etc. And it's completely understandable. But that's led to, a few things that I've spotted from my runners and also online about, querying the accuracy of race distances, for example, versus what it says on your GPS watch. So I wanted to just take a little bit of time to explain a little bit, she says dropping it, how my fairly vintage Garmin now, how GPS works and how it is not 100% accurate. So GPS actually covers a whole multitude of different systems called different things. GPS actually refers to the original global positioning system created by the Americans for military use and then sold on commercially, a kind of slightly down-tuned, marginally less accurate version, but for commercial use a few years later. So there are lots of different systems out there now. The actual system called GPS, the original American one, is one of many different systems that manufacturers like Garmin will pay to get access to in order to provide position information for your devices. So I guess the first thing to say is that there are lots of different companies providing lots of different systems, and some of them will have more or less satellites in the sky. So the way that GPS works, there are a whole web of different satellites and all sorts of other space junk in orbit around our Earth all the time. And these positioning specific satellites will be used to triangulate the position of where your watch or your device is. So if you remember back to geometry at school, you've got your watch here, you'll need at least 3 different satellites in the sky. Between the satellite and the watch, they'll be able to work out how far your watch is away in a direct line between those 3 satellites, and then using the difference in the distance between each one, it will be able to work out exactly where your watch is on the surface of the planet. It needs at least 3 connections to do that. The more connections it has to more different satellites, the more accurate that reading is going to be. So, first variable here is that, as I mentioned, there are lots of different companies now that provide global positioning style systems that different companies and watch manufacturers or app and phone manufacturers are using. And it will be a little bit of natural variation in terms of accuracy across those. Also, historically, more of the companies that have been launching satellites into space to provide these services have been based in North America and Europe, so the coverage of those areas is likely to be better. That is changing, but generally you do get better satellite coverage and therefore accuracy in North America and Europe. The other factor is how many of these satellites have that company put into space. As I mentioned earlier, the more connections to more different satellites your device has, the better the accuracy. So if you've got a company like the original GPS, they've been doing it for a while now, your accuracy is likely to be better if there are potentially more satellites up in the sky for your watch to connect to. So a few variables we've identified there already. In terms of building on that point of the more satellites your watch can connect to, the better, it's worth also pointing out that satellite, much like if you've got a Sky satellite dish at home, the engineer who came to fit that will be checking that it has direct, uninterrupted line of sight to the sky. So a satellite dish or your watch or phone is connecting to an actual satellite in the sky, and it transmits its data through a direct line of sight. So there cannot be any trees, buildings, other stuff that might be in the way. It has to have a complete line of sight connection in between. So your watch needs a line of sight connection with at least 3 satellites in order to get an accurate reading. So I mentioned trees. This lovely woodland that I'm sat in front of is a wood that's local to me. Lots of trees, less direct line connections to the satellite, less GPS accuracy. The part of the London Marathon course around the Docklands, a bit notorious because those high skyscraper buildings mean less direct connections to those satellite, lower GPS accuracy. So, you know, cities, woods, anything where you've got lots of stuff that's going to be interrupting that line of sight connection and reducing the number of satellites that your watch or phone can see, the less accurate that information is going to be. The other thing that is also worth thinking about is that your device is not getting a continuous readout on exactly where you are all of the time. It is taking a reading at intervals. So it's like playing, you know, those dot-to-dot drawings maybe you did when you were little. It's taking a number of dots to show you on a map of where you are, and then the software in the watch or the app will join those together to form your run route. So there can be a bit of a pro versus con of how accurately, how often those GPS dots are recorded. Because the more GPS dots are recorded, the more energy it's using to take those measurements and to save them, and the more storage space it needs to save them on your watch. So the more frequently it's taking those GPS readings, the shorter your battery life is going to be out on a run. So different manufacturers, and that might be for the phone hardware, the apps that the phones use, different watch manufacturers and specs will take the readings at different intervals. So if you're on a fairly, you know, a road that's got a gentle curve in it, or a route that's, you know, sort of fairly kind of simple and straightforward, it doesn't really matter, because a reading every, I don't know, second or so will provide a little bit of a dot-to-dot. A reading of 5 seconds or so will probably be equally as accurate. But to give you an example, I did a race a good few years ago now that had a really, really wiggly route. It was out on the trails in the woodland, which disrupted the GPS, but then there was a bit kind of out in the around field edges and things. And in order to get the distance in, there were lots of switchbacks, turning around, twiddles and stuff. So whilst I might have run, you know, in a bit of a kind of wiggle like that, my GPS would have only been taking location markers at certain points there. So it might have taken a GPS location marker here, 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 and here. So it would have shortened the distance. It will have cut the corners on that wiggly route, because it's not taking a continuous read of where you are. It's just taking little snapshots every now and again. So yeah, those are a few kind of key reasons why GPS isn't 100% accurate. And I see quite a few people kind of complaining a little bit on social media that their GPS says something different to the distance on a race that they've signed up to. Yeah, probably will. And whether that's less or more, who's to know? Loads of factors that we've just talked through that are at play. Racers that are kind of authorised and signed off by UK Athletics or England Athletics, road racers that is, will have had an official course measurement. That needs to be taken every few years. It needs to be taken every time the course is changed. So by going for a kind of properly accredited race, you are much more likely to get something that's been accurately measured. Bearing in mind that at bigger races like the London Marathon, you might notice if you've watched the television coverage, there's a blue line painted on the road, and that is the 26.2 mile distance. So the elites will be following that line, because that they don't want to run over distance. Us mere mortals often end up running a bit over distance because we're with a whole load of people on a wide road, and we might not be taking that most efficient line around the course the whole time. A couple of other things to mention. Is that different technologies, and these might be in your phone. So my phone, for example, has a step counter on it. It tells me, you know, how many steps I've done in the day, and it also tells me what distance that equates to. Now, my phone is not tracking my GPS the whole time. It's calculating that by counting my steps and then making an assumption. I think it knows my height, and it's made an assumption based on my height about the length of my stride. So it's times the length of my stride by the number of steps I've taken, and that's given me a rough distance of how far it thinks I've walked or run in a day. Now, that is even less accurate than GPS, because if it's got that stride length calculation slightly wrong, you can kind of see how that inaccuracy starts to build quite quickly. So a lot of Fitbits, for example, not all of them, but some of them, depending on the model and the tech, a lot of phone, sort of built-in phone activity trackers will be doing it based off stride length times step count, which is less accurate, generally speaking, than GPS. The other little thing to mention is treadmills. So some watches have a treadmill mode. So instead of using the GPS to track your distance, they revert to the accelerometer in the watch measuring that step count, and again an assumption about your stride length. So GPS watch measurements aren't actually GPS at that point when you're on a treadmill, because you're not going anywhere, so the GPS doesn't help. But again, that's more inaccurate because it's reverting to that step count times stride length calculation where the error can creep in quite quickly. Generally speaking, if a treadmill has been maintained and calibrated fairly regularly, the stats on the treadmill screen itself should be relatively accurate, but that's an assumption there about them being calibrated as often as they should be, which in big gyms, or to be honest with you, if I had a treadmill at home, I probably wouldn't be calibrating it very often. So there we go. It's tempting to look at that GPS watch and, oh, it's 3.74 miles and think that must be right. It's not. There's a number of reasons that it's taken me 10 minutes to go through as to why that's not the case. But as long as you know that, and we don't have to get too hung up on the minutiae of the detail, all is good.